Hi guys, welcome to part 2 of the Road to Revolution. This is about the Texas Revolution, the events that lead up to it. It's a really sort of intricate story. It's got a lot of nice, really cool parts to it. And today we're going to talk about Mier y Teran, this guy who writes a report trying to make sure that Texas remains a part of Mexico, and it causes things to sort of escalate. This is part of that overall pattern we discussed before, a timeline that we saw with the Spanish missions where things kind of fell apart. Remember, they had troubles in Texas with the missions, they weren't working. They sent Marquis de Ruby to investigate, and he made a recommendation that caused the missions to close down. And we know that leads to the filibusters, and it's just a big mess. Well, last time we looked, there was problems in Texas, and when it came to the Texas Revolution with the Fredonian Rebellion. People underneath Hayden Edwards tried to break away, but were quickly put down. This time, it looks like Mexico is going to do the same thing. They're going to send someone to investigate. They're going to send Mier y Teran to see what the problems are. So, some basic facts about it. Mier y Teran comes in 1829, and he visits Coahuila y Tejas. Remember, Texas is not its own state at this point. It is combined with Coahuila, and its capital is not Austin or even San Antonio. It's a place called Saltillo, so much further south. So people who are involved are Mier y Teran, and then we're going to talk about the bigger government policies, the difference between federalists and centralists, and I'll explain to you who those people are in just a minute. Well, after the Fredonian Rebellion, the Mexican government was very suspicious of what was happening in Texas. Were these impresarios bringing in Anglo settlers who were becoming Mexican, or were they all just filibusters? They sent a guy named General Don Manuel de Mier y Teran, who had been a very successful sort of scientist and had been involved in the military, and they asked him to go visit Texas and just do some reports. And he stayed with different impresarios, and even he and Stephen F. Austin seemed to admire each other. But Mier y Teran was very, very worried about what he saw in Texas. Some of the things he noticed in his report was, well, that there were a lot more Anglo people than there were Tejanos or even Mexicans in Texas. In fact, Anglos outnumbered Tejanos and Mexicans 10-1, and that really worried him. He said the more Anglos we have, the harder it is for us to make them become Mexican citizens, to become Catholic, to act as if they were Mexican. He also noticed that one of the biggest things that worried him was that slaves were pretty abundant. There was a lot more slaves than there should have been. In fact, there really shouldn't have been many. And he noticed that the people who owned slaves were getting more land and their land grants. And of course, a lot of these Anglos weren't practicing Catholicism. They weren't acting Mexican. They weren't speaking Spanish. They were acting just like Americans. In fact, some of them were celebrating the 4th of July. Some of them were flying American flags, which would be a big problem in a place where you're very worried about people being filibusters. So Mier y Teran sees all this and he writes a report. Now that in and of itself isn't bad, but what happens with his report is what makes it so interesting. In 1829, the current president was a guy named Vicente Guerrero. Now Vicente Guerrero was a guy who was strongly against slavery. He was half Amerindian, half former slave, like his family members had been slaves. So he was actually pretty forward-looking. He was wanting federalism. He wanted the states to have more power. He was about relaxing the control of government, and he was very much against slavery, though. He wanted equality for a lot of people. And he had a friend who also supported him in this. His friend's name was Antonio Lopez de Santa Anna. So these two guys were kind of saying we want the states to have more control and have more power. And a lot of Texans would like that, because then they could argue that they could have their slaves. Well, in 1829, Vicente Guerrero was surprisingly taken out of power by government. Someone overthrew the government, and he was replaced by a guy named Anastasio Bustamante. Now, Bustamante, it was a centralist. He did not believe in states having power. He believed that the central government, that Mexico City should have control over almost all the decisions. He was almost, you would say, a dictator in that sense. And people like Santa Anna did not support him. Unfortunately, Vicente Guerrero was executed a few years later, and Bustamante was in power. And so Mexico will go from kind of being a federalist country where Texas seemed to have had a chance to have more freedom to a centralist government where they will have a lot less. And that's going to be frustrating because Mier y Teran's report will go to a centralist government and they're going to say, yes, we need to have more regulations. So here's some outcomes. Mexico will not allow Texas to have as many freedoms as before. They'll see that Texans and Anglos have been abusing the whole question of being Catholic. They're not following the anti-slave laws. They're really going to crack down on them. And so they're going to put some very severe laws into place. Next time we'll look at some of those laws, see how they play out, and how the Texans deal with that.